Me again. So the last public business meeting was held on the 6th of November 2019 with zero vying in the chair. And the debate we had was on the motion this House believes that Trinity is failing its students. Between then and today, look, on a break from the time that Patrick Prendergast presumably spends sitting in a dark room, petting a cat, and practicing the best I've been expecting you to the impression, he has actually managed to find the time to leave a wreath of poppies at the postgrad study room. Presumably the first interaction that he's had with postgrad in about 3 years, given those protests. But look, next time, and I don't want to let my personal politics slip out here. I've never done that in the minutes before. I would just prefer that he write a note, something like this. Dear Northern Irish students of Trinity, and in fact any student of Trinity whose ancestors have been murdered by British soldiers. Hey. Get fucked. Your history means nothing to me. Yours sincerely. And then his name. Anyway, we have that debate. This I believe the Trinity is failing its students. It passed almost unanimously. And you know what? Sometimes it's nice to be proven right. There being no further business meeting.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting? Controversial, okay. There being none, I can sign, and I'd like to call upon the auditor to introduce, I suppose, our main speakers.
Hello everybody. This is the part of this evening's proceedings where we actually have the debate. This is for public business. I'd like to thank Sophie for both convening the Maidens Competition and for injecting so much personal politics into it. So, we don't know how she does it. I'd also like to thank our sponsor EY for making this event possible, as they have done for our other events, including our Margaret Atwood talk earlier this year. If anyone would like to speak about EY after this evening's proceedings, we have a representative here that you can find during our reception. I'd also like to welcome our judges, who will be looking at this debate from a more pragmatic point of view, but finally to the most important people we have with us this evening, our Maidens finalists. So these are we only have one, they're so this evening we have the 8 best student speakers from a huge pool of people who signed up to speak in this competition. So the last, since the term began, we have been holding weekly debates, a couple of rounds, judging, feedback, all of this. And the 8 people who are sitting here today represent a huge amount of effort from both the committee and from themselves. And I think they all deserve a round of applause before we On your seats you can find these introductions. They introduce the debate and the speakers so that you can learn more about them. I can quickly read out. So I will also introduce them in case you're not here. So on the first proposition we have Sean Gray, he is a first year professor student, and we also asked our speakers to give an interesting fact. So I will read out that interesting fact. And Sean can read his ears. So I suppose that they're your eyebrows, Sean.
I said hair.
On the second prop, we have Sean O'Leary. He is a first year English and philosophy student and is responsible for at least 70% of the revenue of Jan Street Food on Ann Street. So, congratulations, Sean. On the third prop, we have Eleanor Moreland, and she's a first year professor student also, and whose guilty pleasure is watching tech YouTubers. On the fourth prop this evening, we have Amy Cox. She studies classics and is ancient history and archaeology. Where do you find the time, Amy? She says that a fun fact about herself. No, it says that this is a fun fact about herself, because quote unquote, who even studies classics? On first up this evening, we have Sophie Bannon. She's a first year medical student, and her hobbies include knitting, baking, sewing, and other 1800s activities for women. Second up, we have Iga Manulis, and she's a first year human health and disease student. and she's a big fan of the Hamilton pigeons, including Sophie's Minutes, the most controversial statement of the evening. On third up, we have Lucy Walton. She's a visiting student in English and Classics, and in 7th grade she wrote a full-length musical about the Black Plague that she then destroyed in a fire because it wasn't genius enough. And finally, on fourth up this evening, we have Daniela Williams, a JF Business, Economics and Social Studies student who claims that the most fun fact about her is that she hates children.
It is the most fun fact.
We won't test it. Having introduced this evening's speakers, I'll just quickly go through the standing orders for this evening's debate. So as this is a competitive debate, it will obey all the same rules as the maidens rounds that we've already held. That means that we don't want top audience participation for this event, and this will strictly be kept between the speakers. Speakers will have 7 minutes to make their case. The first and last minute of this is called protected time, meaning that no other competitor can offer a point of information or a POI during that time. And the end of that first minute and the start of the last minute will be signalled by a bell. So you can do right with the bell, exactly like this. And then to mark your time having been elapsed, there will be 2 bells in quick succession. I think that is the sum total of all the standing orders this evening. So I would like to cede the floor back to Professor Gagan to begin this evening's debate.
Thank you very much. I will take this away, this interesting biographical material, and I'm struggling for that final chapter of the book. It's there before me. The motion before us this evening is that this House regrets the institution of marriage, and I'd now like to call on the first person to propose the motion, Sean Gray.
I propose this motion on 3 grounds. That marriage can trap couples in failing relationships, that marriage is often used as a tool of oppression, and finally, that getting married is an expensive, stressful, and ultimately pointless endeavour. First, however, I feel that we should define the important groups here for this debate: couples, children, and society as a whole. I chose couples because they are the centre of this institution. Without them, it won't exist and there'd be no point to this debate. Secondly, I chose children because it has enormous impact on them in a foundational way and in a 20 years later, you're still trying to drink away all your sorrows kind of way. And finally, I chose society because many people would agree that it is a foundational pillar of society, and even if you disagree with that, it has an enormous role in society and how it is structured today. Firstly, however, I'd like to talk about why I feel that marriage perpetuates failing and unstable relationships. Marriage is an investment, I think we can all agree. It's a commitment to someone, but what is often overlooked is that it's not just for Christmas or a year. It's for 50 years. It's when all the looks and all the good looks go away and you're sitting there side by side sharing a cup of tea. That's what we often think of the ideal marriage, somewhere where, despite 50 years of it, you haven't killed the other person quite yet. So, unfortunately, the way our society promotes the institution of marriage almost runs counter to that, because as soon as you meet someone and you start a relationship, marriage becomes kind of the dominant, unseen thing in the room. You're expected to get married, or failing that, you're expected to have a very messy breakup. One or the other. It's 50-50. But the problem is, marriage as an institution is incredibly hard to escape from if you have ended up making a wrong choice. And we'd like to think we're all perfect, but we all have some failings. And that's kind of the problem. As a legal institution, once you're married, your assets are pooled. You are considered kind of a joint entity, and society treats you as such. But the problem is, getting out from a marriage is almost impossible. Divorces are expensive and kind of a last resort. By the time you get to a divorce, you've probably tried marriage counselling, you've tried to come to terms with someone, and it's failed. So it's messy, it's complex, and you really can't stop arguing over who gets the toaster. But that's fine. Sorry. But the big problem is that it can often trap people in these relationships and force them to perpetuate them longer than they actually would have stayed in them. because they're going, well, I've invested in this, I've put time, I've put effort, I've put money, I've put love. I can't break this marriage apart, even when it's toxic to both of the people in it. And what kind of impacts it has beyond the couple are kind of evident. Like, children who grow up with broken or failing marriages don't get the best home life. They don't get the opportunity to know they are loved a lot of the time. And as for society, having like messy divorces, having this entire breakup and this institution that doesn't hold together as well as it should is bad, except for maybe divorce lawyers. But, you know, we don't talk about that. So we don't like having to admit that marriages break up, but they do. And as an institution, I feel we should regret it, because it almost invariably can lead to very difficult situations where we don't need it to have stable, loving relationships. You don't need to be married to tell someone you love them. Secondly, marriage is often used as a tool to put people down or to keep them in their place. You know, in Ireland all those years ago, we had the marriage bar, where a lot of times when a woman married, they were immediately shunted off into the kitchen. They were cut out from society. And it's not just used in that regard to kind of make one part of the couple dependent on the other and force them into a subservient role. It's often used as a tool to isolate people who are considered socially undesirable. Things like gay marriage, for example, the way they're treated, a lot of people are told, no, you don't get to have the same kind of legal rights, or you don't get to have the exact same legal rights as someone because you love you love the same sex, and that's wrong according to society or according to the group that's upholding it at the time. But at the same time, why are we using the institution of marriage to define their love? Why are we saying that a couple can't have a loving, meaningful relationship if they're not married? Why are we kind of punishing people who don't get married or giving them lesser rights, when all too often the use of that marriage is to kind of punish them? It's to cut them off from society. And I think it's kind of easy to see why this can have terrible effects on children, because, you know, they're kind of growing up.
Point.
Yes.
The reason why people in the LGBTQ plus community push for gay marriage is because they wanted that acceptance. They wanted to be seen as married couples. That's something that they actually pushed for.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not saying that them pushing for it is a bad thing. I feel the argument that society uses it as an excuse to get back at them, or is it used as a tool to hurt them, is wrong. That's why I feel the institution of marriage we should regret it, because it is being used to hurt people, even if the intentions or the ideal of marriage we have is very good. So as for society, it kind of having marriage as an institution and embedding it into our lives and making it one of the most important things cuts off people, and it leads to a very fractured society. Finally, I'd like to talk about how, you know, getting married is an expensive, financially not rewarding at all, and incredibly stressful. You know, like, weddings are a nightmare to plan, to pay for, to wake up after the next morning and realize your family has been embarrassing again. So it's, you know, we've all heard of Bridezilla. I don't think we need to go into that too much. So
Point?
yes.
Why are you really focusing on this? Oh, I'm sorry.
So yeah, I feel like the actual act of getting married is a burden on the people who are getting married, and it makes them they have to spend funds, and they have to you know, put a lot of effort into something that the only reason they're doing it all too often is because society says, well, this is what you have to do when you get married. You know, 100 years ago you didn't need a white dress, but that doesn't matter. You need the best white dress, you need the best cake, and you need to make sure that everyone gets 3 glasses of champagne. So yeah, I think this has a huge and often detrimental effect on the people in the couple and the children, and that's why I beg you to propose.
We oppose the motion and now call on Sophie Bannon.
Is it good? Okay. Let's wait.
Are you waiting for me?
No, for the people behind you, sorry. Awkward, okay. Panel, this proposition wants to villainize marriage without ever weighing it against its innate and exclusive benefits that it provides to our society. They don't want to look at what would fill marriage's place within our society if we were to regret the institution itself. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to respond to what we just heard from that last speaker. Then I'm going to tell you what alternatives are likely to arise in place of not having marriage. And then comparatively, what are the unique benefits of marriage that we get on our side of the house. So what did we hear from that last speaker? I think we broadly agree with the actors that he wants to mention. When he talks about marriage trapping people in bad relationships, I think the vast majority of marriages are not in the extreme circumstance. The vast majority are not dealing with like an abusive relationship, but I think there are also other harms there that they would not be able to escape, even if this wasn't a marriage as such, but like either way, they're probably not able to escape those. So I think that we're not dealing with those in the vast majority of instances. We think that what the vast majority of instances are is where you start to have struggles within that relationship, as every couple begins to have, but like you're able to work through them with marriage, or you're incentivized to do so because you know there's a link with you and your couples. That means that there's more incentive for you to continue to work through it because you know in a couple of years they're still going to be around in a way that you don't have a long-term relationship, because comparatively more likely you're just going to walk away from it because it's so much easier because there isn't that same connection between you and that other person. But then they talk about bad circumstances. We say that like divorce or separation are not as impossible as they say, and then people do get divorced everywhere just because there are stringent laws within the UK and Ireland. We think that they are like much more liberal in other areas, but even in the places where they are not the most liberal, then we think that there are probably like societal reasons why it's made hard. It's because people like the stability of marriage, and by making it harder to get divorced, then you increase the stability of marriage and you increase it as like a thing that you can always rely on within that society. There's a positive thing that people want, and we think that the positivity was never balanced against that in that last speech. When they talk about it as, no thanks, tool of oppression, we say that like the tool of oppression, that is a product of women just not having enough rights within the society. Likely you are going to use any tool you can to oppress women, but we see that more and more when you have more liberalized societies, you have a much more equal partnership. You have women using that as a tool of actually getting capital and advancement within that society because they have a partnership with this person, they can access their capital too. When they say society uses an excuse, we're unclear what this means, but furthermore, we're unsure considering the LGBTQ plus community push for this because they see the institute of marriage as something that they want to have, something that they see as something desirable to them because that is a signal of love that everyone broadly accepts as something that is good and positive within that society. That is something that they push for, and therefore we don't see how it's used against them, considering it was explained by the last speaker. They talk about it's expensive. I think it is, they broadly just assert that it's no way rewarding. Maybe I want to wear the nice dress. Like maybe that's something that I would find very rewarding, to dress up real nice. But also we think that like there's no obligation for you to actually dress up real nice. I think if it's like you can just go to the registry officer, like there are things that you can do to avoid those things, and if you just want to make it about love, sure you can do that too. I think that there's no reason to have that wedding. But like what does this whole thing mean for the debate? We think that broadly that takes out a lot of what they say about those in the worst instances, but also it deals with what happens even in like the vast majority where it's just about like the main harm being paying for weddings. We think that we take that out of the debate too. So onto my substantive. Why do we think an alternative will arise? I think that broadly speaking, humans still want the exact same things in their lives that push them towards marriage in the first place. First being companionship, because we are social creatures who want to interact with others on a long-term basis. We get meaning out of those relationships. We think that they are in some way helpful to us and our conception of life. But secondly, they want security. They want to be able to rely on others constantly within their life in a way that they don't just flit in and out, but someone who's always going to be there for you. I think that likely the only thing that changes, no thanks, is the societal pressure to get married. Jesus. Wrong side of the motion, guys. But to a certain extent, there's still a pressure of being seen as the person who's always going to be alone and reliant on others. So you still have a pressure to be involved in long-term relationships. So I think that accrues a lot of the harms they are probably yet to bring up on proposition. So I think that there is still some kind of pressure there. But what are the alternatives likely to arise in place of that marriage, and why are they worse? Firstly, long-term partnerships. I think you're still going to want to be with someone, even if it doesn't look like a marriage, even if it just looks like hanging around with them a lot. I think that you lose all the benefits of stability, though, because you don't have the same ties to them that the last speaker criticized. Because you have constant threat of them leaving means you don't have a fulfilling relationship because you can never truly get comfortable because you know that they will just walk away if it gets too difficult. That means that you don't actually share with them the problems. So you never actually get to work through those. You don't get the same benefits of being able to like have support from someone, considering that you never get to actually connect with them in that meaningful way. But that's also mean like less attachment to people and ties because there's no reason to invest that time into other people and make sure that they are better. And if proposition wants to claim that they can have these like permanent style relationships, then it's unclear that distinct a difference between marriage, which I think we prove on our side of the house. Secondly, about isolation. I think that we end up with a lot of people just being alone because people flit in and out of relationships with relative ease. Then people put less emphasis on the continuity of relationships. Then you will just spend like longer periods of time being alone where you don't feel as much meaning because you do want to be with other people and you do want to have those long-term relationships. And that long-term isolation, which directly clashes with what the last speaker tells us about isolation. I think that long-term isolation, when compared to the fulfilling marriage that you could have, is just not good enough. To be left alone without that feeling of security, that any kind of meaning, I think just isn't good enough for you. Before I go on, sure.
But do you not think that if we didn't have marriage, we could put emphasis on other relationships like friendships and maternal relationships that are just as important as marriage?
Okay, just getting on to really good friends is actually my third actor here. Really good mates. I think you want a friend as a substitute for the lack of companionship, as Amy tells you there, but I think it's just not as fulfilling for these reasons. I think this also plays into like maternal relationships or paternal relationships or whatever you want to talk about there. I think they're not as fulfilling because you don't invest the same level into friends, because like a lot of time your friends are weirdos. And the reason for this is because you don't look for them like you look for a mate. When you're looking for a mate, you want to be compatible with them. When you're looking for a friend, it's because you need someone to sit next to you in your next lab. Like that is what your calculus is when you're making those two things. Meaning that you never want to pick someone who's actually going to be really, really good for you, but rather you just pick someone who's going to entertain you for a little while. That means you're not going to have the same meaningful relationship. But also, sorry to all my friends in the room, I don't have much of a meaningful relationship with them, but also like you just don't want to invest the same level into them because they just don't put the same level into you, because there's many friends in comparison to that one person, and that means that you'll just end up relying on them to the same extent, which means you accrue all the harms of like being overly reliant on the person that the proposition wants to talk about. Okay, so comparatively, what are the unique benefits of marriage then on the flip side? I think firstly it's a sign of love. It's a very public declaration of your love to those around you, and that means a lot for someone who's looking for stability within their life. To be supported by someone and for everyone to know is a very comforting feeling, but also it shows you're progressing within your relationships, because like we want to take love out of the situation. We're goal-based people, and that means that if we're constantly working towards something that is inspiring towards us, and it creates a better long-term relationship because you know you're getting a long-term benefit out of that. Secondly, it looks like equality. I think I already discussed this when I talked about like women being able to use it as access to capital in the future if that is a more liberal society, and how that social advancement is incredibly impactful to those, even if it's only a little bit. But thirdly, permanence. I think because this contractual obligation that you talk about means you can literally bank on it. It means that you can continually invest things into it, and your happiness is improved by being able to get through the bad times faster because you always have that support. So why is all this important? I think the most important metric on which we can judge life, let alone this debate, is based off happiness and then quality of life. And I think that people find life has more meaning when they can engage with others in a way that enhances their life experience, in a way that exclusively marriage brings to you, considering the relationship that accrues in comparison to others that I just brought you. But I think that gives them a reason to exist in a much more meaningful capacity that is much further than just like surviving or getting from day to day, or like flitting between friends, but actually investing so much of yourself into someone else that you feel something every time they look at you. That kind of marriage, that kind of meaning that you find, that is so much better. I think that I've given reason to suggest that these benefits are far more likely to accrue to more people with marriage as an institution, and if not, even like those are benefits to marriage in and of itself to the few people who get it. For all these reasons, so happy to oppose.
I now call on the second speaker to propose the motion, Sean O'Leary.
There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today for two reasons. One, the Hiss gave us a fancy dinner, and two, to convince you that marriage deserves our regret. To regret an institution is to regret its essential qualities and the impact it has on the world. So, the burden set upon the proposition, me, is to state why marriage as an institution, in an essential sense, is worthy of our regret. I will define marriage as a legal commitment to exist in a romantic relationship with a specific person until the end of time, or at least until one of them fucks their secretary and files for divorce. I can see two main stakeholders in this debate: individuals in relationships and wider society. And wider society. I will first explain why marriage fails to achieve its set purpose in consolidating the love between two people. Next, I will move on to explaining why this is not just pointless, but damaging. My 2 points in this regard will focus on each of these stakeholders, as I first argue that marriage is damaging to the individual who enters it because it reduces the authenticity, satisfaction, and meaning derived from relationships. And second, that it is damaging to wider society because it allows for more scope for exploitation than is justified. And if I have time, I might go on to focus that it perpetuates and is founded on misogynistic ideas. Firstly, why marriage is purposeless. Let's assume that the purpose of marriage is to solidify the love between two individuals in order to give the relationship more meaning. If this is the case, then in a truly loving and authentic romantic relationship with good communication and compatibility, there is simply no need for marriage because both parties will remain faithfully together for as long as they both desire it. This can be applied to rationality too. If both parties think that it is a good idea, a rational idea to remain monogamously together, irrespective of love, such as in cases, no thank you, where couples stay together for the kids or where both parties just want companionship, then they will do so with or without a marriage. My parents are happily married, but the marriage is simply a formality which has barely contributed to their relationship. The fact that they love each other means that they would, in effect, have remained together anyway, or so I hope. There is no actual real difference between a good romantic relationship and a marriage, except that you cannot easily leave a marriage. Therefore, it is not true that marriage serves the purpose it claims to do in solidifying the love between two persons. Even if I take the opposition at their best and assume that marriage is good for a relationship or to society, it still won't be enough to outweigh the negative effects I'm about to outline. The main reason why marriage is bad for the individual relationship lies in the fact that marriage reduces the authenticity and meaningfulness of interpersonal relationships. To paraphrase Lizzo, you could have had a bad bitch, non-committal, but instead you got trapped in an emotionally unfulfilling legal contract, and now you're filing for divorce. In order to understand this point, it must be understood not just in terms of love, but in terms of existential meaning. The object, presumably, of existing in a romantic relationship with a life partner is not just that they're sexy and cool, it's that being in a mutually loving relationship with them gives your life more meaning. No, thank you. I'll argue that marriage reduces this meaning and adds nothing in exchange. The impetus for remaining together, which I would call the bonding agent of a romantic relationship, ought to be a mutual desire to do so, to remain together. This desire ought to be based on romantic love and or rational desire and freely given. A bonding agent ought to be freely retractable in order to be meaningful. If one cannot easily withdraw the bonding agent, if it is guaranteed in advance, as is the case with marriage in the traditional sense, then it has no value. For in order for something to command a value, it must be in finite supply. Nobody worries that air will suddenly disappear because it's guaranteed to be here by the laws of nature. No, thank you. Likewise, nobody worries that their partner will suddenly disappear because they're mandated to remain in the relationship by the laws of the land. Because an individual no longer needs to motivate their partner to remain in the relationship, marriage promotes behaviours which reduce the meaningfulness and satisfaction of the relationship in general, such as the stagnation of sex or a reduction in declarations of love. Even if these behaviours don't manifest themselves, in an even more fundamental sense, the inability of one's partner to withdraw from the relationship might ease our worries, but it makes the relationship less meaningful inherently for one reason. It is more of a validation of our existence when our partner could leave us but chooses not to, out of nothing but their love for us, than if they can't leave us at all. Contrary to what Sophia said, you may be more comfortable in a relationship where you know your partner will not leave, but this comfort is based on illusion and falsehood, so it is less meaningful and less significant. Yes.
Don't you think it's harder to get to a good romantic long-term relationship considering that you have that impulse that someone might leave and that is a fear that you then have?
No, I disagree because anyone who enters into a romantic relationship, they can simply make the contract between themselves. It demonstrates a lack of trust with your partner if you have to rely on an external source for that staying power. Of course, divorce has become an option in the modern day, so to get out of the finality of marriage, but this is a subversion of the original purpose of marriage. Additionally, divorce itself is a prohibitive barrier, being a long, difficult process that sometimes must be legally justified, and is thus no comparison to simply leaving your boyfriend. In fact, our desire for divorce is an admission that the institution of marriage is in an essential sense flawed, and must be modified in order to be acceptable to society. All the factors I mentioned are a bad thing because they reduce the meaning derived from marriage, but it is in the interest of the individual to gain as much meaning and satisfaction as possible from a romantic relationship.
Point.
No, thank you. This is uniquely important because it impacts every single person who gets married and shows why the argument that marriage benefits a relationship is flawed and counterfactual. Thus, we ought to regret marriage. My second point begs the question: does the institution of marriage benefit society? No, obviously not. I will develop a point on why the institution of marriage allows for the entrapment of vulnerable individuals, and a second point on why it isn't. No, actually, never mind. Maybe I'll do that. I don't think I'll have time. First, I would contend that unnecessary legal restrictions cause more harm than good by providing a breeding ground for exploitation. Legal restriction is the fundamental and defining characteristic of marriage, along with a commitment to respect these restrictions. It is the only thing that separates it from a non-conjugal romantic relationship. By legal restriction, I of course mean restrictions on divorce, but also the process of divorce, no thank you, itself, which may be emotionally taxing, arduous, and prohibitively expensive in the form of legal fees, alimony payments, and estate conflicts. This legal resolution can be immensely damaging to individuals who are pressured into the marriage. This may occur in cases of, among others, manipulation, blackmail, emotional or physical abuse, and financial dependence. The existence of marriage as an institution thus allows the entrapment and exploitation of those in abusive, emotional, and financial situations. This is a potential evil that is deeper and more damaging than any potential other effect is beneficial. No, thank you. It uniquely impacts the most vulnerable members of society, particularly women, disabled people, the mentally ill, those in debt or financial destitution, or on the fringes of society in any way. By being rid of marriage, we would lose approximately nothing, as I've just proven, and gain a world in which it is easier for those in abusive relationships to escape those relationships. For this reason, as well as my previous argument for how marriage makes romantic relationships less authentic and less meaningful, we as individuals ought to regret the institution of marriage. Finally, I'd just like to respond to Sophie's point on women gaining economic capital from their marriages. I do not think this is a good basis for achieving economic equality if women must depend on men in order to be financially successful. I think this is both patronising and also achieves very little, because women are still victims of that power relationship where they're dependent on men for their economic capital. I've just done the following. I've shown that marriage really contributes nothing to a relationship except legal restrictions. These legal restrictions are an overwhelmingly bad thing because they make a relationship less authentic and less meaningful. In the area it also continues to provide scope for exploitation, both sexist and otherwise. The burden of the opposition now is to prove that whatever they can conjure up is worth all of the negatives I've just outlined. I'm confident that they will not, and delighted to propose.
Now on the second speaker to oppose the motion, Iga Mama.
So I wanted to include a few jokes initially, because lest we forget it is a social event. I've left my room for the first time in weeks, and showing a bit of humanity through weak humour is rather encouraged, but you'll be glad to know that none of the jokes actually made the cut, and I've probably spared you some major second-hand cringe, so I'll just get into it anyway. My case today will rest on 3 simple propositions. So firstly, although long-term relationships and love can of course exist outside of marriage, marriage contributes to protecting this bond between individuals. Secondly, that such an institution protects individuals within the marriage more effectively than in a long-term relationship. And finally, that this idea of marriage is increasingly important in a world teetering with impulsiveness, self-indulgence, and filled with abundance. These 3 propositions will establish why we should not regret the institution of marriage. On top of that, I will demonstrate the benefits of such a formal union to the people actually involved in it, as well as to our society. So from the outset, it is important to clarify we are not debating regretting the institution of marriage as this heteronormative, oppressive, and patriarchal concept that has emerged in the past. No, because if we argue about old-fashioned conceptions of marriage, or even relationships in general for that matter, we will most definitely run into problems when confronted with a modern, progressive society. Such a one-dimensional definition of marriage proves to be insufficient in our debate because we observe marriage to be something to the contrary. It is ever-changing. Why? Well, because it is ultimately shaped by society. As long as societal structure, values, and goals change over time, so will our ideas of marriage along with it. Proof of this is in the fact that nowadays we have secular marriages. Women no longer have to leave their jobs after getting married, and we have same-sex marriages, whereas before this would have been unacceptable and unthinkable. Marriage, therefore, has this capacity to extend to new cases without... No, thank you. Marriage, therefore, has this capacity to extend to new cases without changing its meaning. This is important in the context of this debate because it means that accepting marriage is not mutually exclusive to a society which is diverse, non-discriminatory, and in which we are opening doors to a variety of family forms. And that is desirable because it eliminates defining family units through stereotypes, prejudices, and biases. Okay, but why is marriage itself something important and valuable? Well, firstly, it protects the bond between individuals by acting as this inhibitor of impulse. By submitting to the dictates of marriage, we are acknowledging the insight that, yes, as people, we have tendency to make very poor choices under the influence of strong short-term impulses. We recognize that sometimes we require your structure to stop us from our own urges, and the institution of marriage provides the structure through vows we exchange with our partner and the obligations that naturally follow marriage life. Temptations will continue to exist even without the institution of marriage, but marriage comes with these vows and promises, a couple exchanges that remind you of certain conditions you agree to. No, thank you. Such an arrangement protects us from lust and what we desire, and yet maybe in our more rational moments we know that we don't truly need or want. So secondly, I'll discuss how the institution of marriage protects the individual even if a relationship ends. And this is relevant because if we abandon the concept of marriage, we are also abandoning the concept of divorce. So in order to do this, let's imagine a world in which marriages don't exist. Yet we still have to acknowledge that we are human and make mistakes, and our relationships sometimes have to end. So let's imagine a couple living together. They have similar responsibilities and obligations to a married couple, and let's say their economic statuses as individuals change, and that is a matter separate from their life as a family unit. What do I mean by that? So let's say they have children, and one parent may turn to working part-time or give up paid work entirely to meet the demands of child rearing. So we get into problems following a separation of such a relationship without marriage because there is a difficulty to define what exactly is a fair split. And it's debatable whether such a division of property can be done justly by two biased individuals that have an interest in what is being distributed. And yes, divorces also have disadvantages. They take a long time and are costly, but they are also more fair because they are regulated by outside professional unbiased bodies. Okay, so finally, this concept of marriage is increasingly important in our world where so many things are utterly disposable, from plastic cups to romantic partners. In such a world, believing in marriage is a bold, unobvious move. It's believing in this idea that we are not merely selfish individuals roaming the planet, driven only by personal gain and selfish desires. It's this idea that we are capable of committing to another person for not just a conveniently not defined long time, but for the rest of our life. It's this idea that we are capable of sharing something so intrinsically valuable as our own life. So what does marriage do? It shows humans to be something more than biological, selfish machines. No, thank you. We are able to perform selfless acts and make sacrifices for things that we believe to be important. And even though that continues to occur in society in various forms, marriage is such an incredibly impactful example because long-term relationships affect such a great deal of our society. Marriage is this shining example of putting another person before yourself in various situations. In fact, it is a lifelong declaration to do so many times. No, thank you. And it's not about the idea, and marriage protects this part of humanity. And it's not about the fact that, of course, your judgment regarding whether a particular person is right for such commitment may be misjudged, or that you personally don't want to make such a lifelong declaration. It's about the idea that such a mindset in our world is possible, and that's what's desirable, a mindset that we are not scared to abandon other tempting possibilities. And marriage is not about having to explain, declare, or formalize something to the state, to our community, or to society. Marriage just shows that we are so certain of our decision to commit to someone that we are not scared for it to be recognized by our partner and other around us. Such an essence of marriage is something that is most certainly not regrettable, and for these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
A few weeks ago, I was having one of those really deep and meaningful conversations with my roommates, you know the ones where you talk about your thoughts and feelings, your dreams for the future, all that good stuff. When you talk about how, although you're studying philosophy, politics, economics, and sociology, all you ever really wanted to do was become a dancer, even though you don't have any training in it. Anyway, in the course of this conversation, my friend told me that I am more of a second wife. Now, this was totally well-intentioned and I'd say pretty accurate. But I can't say that it didn't make me question some things about myself in the world. In the same way that telling someone, oh, you're so great, you just couldn't care less what people think about you, is well-intentioned, but also probably makes them ask some questions about what it is that's so repulsive they're doing to everyone else that they just don't know about. The conclusion that I eventually came to after some careful consideration about sort of my place with marriage in the world is that marriage is at best like a 1 out of 10. Tonight, I will tell you that's because it's been used all too often to oppress and coerce people, and we think that the historical examples of that have been so harmful and so frequent that that's enough to justify it. But before I do that, some rebuttal. So, broadly, we thought that the main issue that's kind of come up in this debate is this idea of stability and security, both on a broader social level and when it comes to the individual. So what do we hear from the opposition on this? We hear the opposition characterise the ultimate alternative to marriage that we think would happen anyway as this kind of long-term relationship that's built in terms of compatibility and in terms of companionship. These are the criteria that they gave because they prized happiness as the thing that would ultimately drive this alternative. We thought that this would be similarly long-term in nature. However, we also thought that if we were to accept that characterisation, that we must accept that that is available on both sides. We had to accept that that compatibility compatibility and that companionship, the things that keep people in marriages, were always going to exist either way. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because like people walk out of marriages without notice all the time. People who are hell-bent on getting divorced and leaving their partner will always do it anyway, because right now they do it anyway. No, thank you. So what else do we hear on this point from second opposition? So we hear that it protects individuals in marriage from lust and temptation. Well, we thought that that just wasn't true. Like, we know that people cheat on their partner all the time. There was no reason that a legal recognition that they didn't give us the reason that a legal definition of that marriage was necessarily enough for a person who was willfully going to cheat to stop cheating. They were always going to do that anyway if they really, really wanted to. But then what else do we hear from this? We hear then that we would have to also abandon the concept of divorce, and therefore we couldn't figure out how to split stuff up equally. Again, we thought that like in a world without marriage, like people could always sue other people for stuff. Like, we didn't see that the legal recognition in this way at the point at which it happened, which was like the start of a relationship as opposed to the end, was necessarily super important. So we thought that those ideas didn't really stand. On to some substantive, and I'll take a point if anyone has one at the moment.
So if you cheat in a marriage, then you're probably more likely to be in a long-term relationship because there's no like economic consequence at the end that you're going to have to pay more alimony at the end. So it's more likely on your side of the house that you have more people cheating in long-term relationships.
Well, we think let's have a look at the actual kinds of people who cheat in marriages anyway. They're usually people who are pretty willful about what they're doing. They're usually people who are fairly reckless anyway. We always thought that like at the point at which you've decided to cheat on your partner, going, hang on, no, but I'm going to have to pay Karen like 50% of my stuff, was never going to be a strong enough incentive if you still wanted to have sex with whatever you wanted to have sex with. Right, so on to a substantive regarding how historically marriage has been used as an instrument of oppression. So we think that it's been used to pressure marginalized individuals and subsequently like manipulate their behavior and keep them on the outskirts of society. And we see this as applying to three main groups in this debate. So we thought this firstly applied to unmarried people. We thought this was generally tended to more be women, but also men. So we thought that pressure comes from family and society. So that's why Grandma asked me at Christmas whether I, at age 18, have found someone to settle down with. When I say no, because I am age 18 and also have crippling commitment issues, she encourages me not to worry and that the perfect man is right around the corner. We think that this pressure has existed for centuries.
Point.
No, thank you. In the 1950s, it was about finding someone and going steadies. In the 1800s, it was about finding someone and making them your betrothed. In the 1500s, it was about finding a nice cousin to secure alliances and keep royal bloodlines pure with. The point is, the institution of marriage and the resulting pressure it generates coerces people through fear of social ostracization because that force is so strong to enter into what were historically lifelong partnerships that had no guarantee that were particularly like happy or fruitful. So we think the oppression and manipulation doesn't end there. No, because thanks to the institution of marriage's patented three-pronged approach to making people do shit they'd rather not do, there is even more. This time, it occurs within marriages. So marriage in its original form was very much about a woman becoming the possession of a man. Super duper fun. In plenty of places around the world, that exact sentiment is still prevalent. Extra super duper fun. Even in places where it's not, there is this sort of holdover the husband is the man of the house, which is super duper extra fucking fun. We think that means he gets like the decision-making power, and that has ultimately resulted, we think, fairly uncontentiously in the restriction of women historically to the home and to childcare duties as well. The reason that we know this control is unique to a world in which marriage exists is the fact that well into the 20th century, many places that were common for women to work, like hospitals, made female staff quit after they got married. This legal recognition was the very reason that women had to stop doing the things that they wanted to do. Now, before I get hit with a chorus of well actuallys, it's actually pretty shitty for men too, because it positioned them as breadwinners who were to provide for a wife and family who they were legally bound to without consideration of whether that's what they'd actually like to be doing. Now to this third group of stakeholders quickly, we thought this was people who were LGBTQ+. Need I say more? Like, we're super glad for the slow march toward legalization that same-sex marriage has had in a lot of countries. We think this is fantastic, but that does not change the fact that for the longest time, it was used as a tool to marginalize gay people, marking their existence as somehow less than because they were not allowed to participate in the institution that people did consider so important, so essential to life. This is really important, and we think it's true not just because my mum calls me her little gorgeous socialist. We also think that it's true. We also think it's really, really important because we have always thought like the historical impacts have been proven, they are very real, and we think that to some extent they continue to this day. We cannot guarantee that on the other side. Everyone, I told you before that I have some regrets about not pursuing my dream of becoming a dancer, but if there's one thing that I regret more, and I've always said this, it is the institution of marriage.
To oppose the motion, I now call on Lucy Walton.
Thank you. Hard to follow that. Okay. 3 points. Marriage played a pivotal role in humanity's past that we could not have developed without. 2, in the present, marriage as an institution represents love and commitment, 2 things society should celebrate. And 3, marriage will continue to be relevant and beneficial to people in the future. And these are going to prove my main point that the world isn't only better because of marriage, but literally wouldn't exist without it. And first, I'm going to define marriage, which I see as a union that to form a familial bond that is recognized legally, religiously, or socially, and that grants participating individuals mutual rights and responsibilities. Knowing that, I'm going to go to my first point, which is marriage was integral to the formation of human society. It's what anthropologists call a cultural universal. That means it is something that is found in literally every human society ever. There's a reason. Along with things like language, death, rituals, etc., cultural universals develop because they achieve key needs for societies to function, and marriage achieves 3. First, and I'm going to try out science, and I'm an English major, so hang in there, but it regulated mating patterns. So pair bonding developed early on for 2 reasons. First, because it guaranteed that any children in a union would be guaranteed to be of that specific pair, and second, because pairs who mated and worked together to ensure their mutual survival and that of their children were able to divide labor between the 2 of them, allowing them to maximize their work and abilities for greatest chance of survival. No other form of mating in the animal kingdom had both of these benefits. Singular sexual encounters meant that the burden of raising children was entirely on the female, and in troop-based species, mating rights were reserved for alpha males who earned their right to mate through violence. Marriage regulated human mating into permanent pair bonds to minimize violence over mates and promoting a system where human children were more likely to survive. Second point, it regulated the transfer, preservation, and consolidation of land, goods, and powers. As humans became more sedentary, there was more of a need to develop formalized systems to determine how land, property, and power were transferred from one generation to another without violence. Because marriage bound children to their parents as a socially accepted unit, they were recognized as having a legitimate claim to their property because it was guaranteed that they were actually the children of those parents. Marriage was pivotal in the development of inheritance laws, which were instrumental in creating social order. Third, it defined kinship ties. By recognizing a permanent union between people, marriage determined who was connected with who. No longer were people's interpersonal relationships ruled by tenuous, fickle personal alliances, but a stable, permanent bond that not only tied you to another person, but with their families and social circles. Marriage created the concept of the family, the unit of people connected through blood and marriage that work together for mutual survival and care. The familial bond established not only your place in society, but a loyalty to a group of people that guaranteed your care or your child's care if something should happen to you. It created the concept of personal security. These kinship circles grew and were especially important to the creation of human society. As families grew, they became more and more connected to other humans around them. For the first time, humans were not only interested in their personal survival, but the well-being of the group. Marriage created the concept of an us, a loyalty outside oneself that eventually evolved into an understanding that what is good for society benefited the family, which benefited the individual. This understanding led to the division of labor, not just within pairs or families, but communities, and this extensive division of labor allowed humans to begin specializing in tasks and jobs. This specialization led to innovations which led to advancement. So these advancements that became the very basis of human society might not have developed at all if marriage hadn't created the collectivist identity that it did. The world would be a very different place. Yes?
Do you not think this development was based on the fact that women weren't going into marriages which weren't consensual, and like often child marriages and forced marriages?
Yeah, so I'm going to address the point kind of the history of marriage in a second, but I think that it's important to recognize that actually in this time period and that I'm talking about, relationships were a lot more egalitarian because they were valuing the work of women. They were saying it's just as important to gather as it is to hunt, and that meant that society was very collectivist and these marriages were allowing that labor to be recognized. It's only later that forced marriages were becoming such a negative thing. Okay, so my second point. The present state of marriage is a celebration of love and commitment, something we should embrace. The proposition has argued against marriage, saying that it doesn't have a place in modern society because of its harmful history of forced marriages, Irish marriage laws, like banning of gay marriage in that. And while I can see that marriage was harmful in a time, I reject the idea that marriage is an irredeemable institution because of that history. It has evolved. It does not mean the same thing that it did even 50 years ago, much less thousands. Marriage is no longer an economic transaction between families. It is from love. It no longer makes women property. It doesn't even make them subservient to their husbands. It isn't even between a man and a woman. It's between two people, regardless of their gender, and children aren't even expected anymore. Marriage today is a completely different institution from the one it once was. It is an enduring bond between two people used to affirm their commitment to one another before their children, families, and communities. It is a public celebration of love, loyalty, commitment, and care, and I see that as an intrinsically good thing. These values motivate us to act selflessly, kindly, and caringly, and while marriage may not guarantee we act in this way, having an institution that pushes us to strive for the best version of ourselves makes the world a better place. Third point, marriage has a very relevant role in our future. The proposition is claimed that marriage is obsolete because, you don't have to get married to express your love to people, and that there's divorce. I'll address both of these things. So they talked a lot about, first and second prop talked a lot, you don't need marriage to show that you love someone. You don't need an actual institution. And yeah, that's right, you don't. However, marriage is a formal, socially recognized agreement to be partners for life. And while committed cohabitation, or just saying hey, we're gonna hang out for life as mates, has some benefits, having a formal promise to say we are going to be together as long as we can be has proven benefits. First, marriage is a promise of commitment no matter what, and this creates a security for people within their relationships. That promise, it's a promise that says even if we fight or you make a mistake, I will try my best to work through that because it transcends day-to-day issues. One of the Seans said oh, that makes that makes it less worth it because then that person isn't making the choice day to day to stay with you. But love isn't something to be held hostage and say hey, you messed up once and I'm gonna leave. And that promise kind of allows couples to grow closer and more genuine and more communicative because they know they have the safety net that they are going to put more work in. And second, it offers a hope of companionship and understanding and assurance that while both people still live, there will be someone to care for the other. And no matter what, you will have someone there for you and you are never alone. Both of these benefits have been shown to have significant mental health benefits because the security that comes with marriage and your relationship, your companionship, eases anxiety among adults because you are at ease with your future. And it's important to acknowledge that some marriages don't work out, but divorce rates actually have been having an impact of making people more seriously take their marriages and do it at a later point and do it when their relationships are more developed. And I think that represents that marriage is continuing to evolve and continuing to make the world a better place because it is just a bond of love and commitment that we have chosen to respect and see as sacred. And for that reason, I beg you to oppose.
I now call on the final speaker for the competition, Amy Cox.
Okay.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Amy, and I think at this point in the debate we're left with two questions. The first is marriage essential for a good relationship? And the second is marriage good for society? And we on the opposite proposition will be telling you here today that it is no on both counts. So I'm going to be delivering these points to you in two main respects. The first one is that relationship favoritism has real and damaging effects on people and society, and the second is that the isolation and privacy of marriage allows abuse to happen behind closed doors very easily. Okay, so my first point is about relationship favoritism. So what I mean by this is that what marriage is essentially a certain type of relationship that the state and the church has ratified. And what happens, what it means is that we put all our social prestige and recognition into one institution, which doesn't really leave much room for variation and comes with a lot of social, economic, and personal pressures. So what happens when you ratify one type of relationship over another? This is a relationship like a purely sexual one between a man and a woman, and but more recently same-sex marriages, but in most states not. It means that you delegitimize other types of relationships. You delegitimize parent-son relationships, father-son relationships, mother-daughter relationships, paternal relationships, grandparent relationships, friendships. No, thank you. And other really important relationships in our society. You delegitimize those, and it ratifies a patriarchal custom that often holds women back. We disrespect and discredit members of society who prefer to cohabit or live with their siblings
siblings, or live with their friends. And we say on proposition that those relationships are just as valid as marriage. We say that the opposition's attitude has generally reflected this bias in their speeches today, because they've said things like, oh, like, let's just shack up for a couple of years, it'll be fun. We say that actually no, cohabitation is an equally valid form of living with someone, because it's still a commitment and a bond of like true love, and you can still have that commitment when you're talking with someone, because we think that the most important thing about love and commitment is that you actually establish that commitment with that person, and not that you like get it legally ratified. We don't think that legal ratification, no thank you, or religious ratification is the most important thing about marriage, and most people would agree with that. So what we say when we fail to celebrate single parents and close friendships and other important relationships, why is it the case that the only truly celebrated relationship in society is a sexual one between a man and a woman? Marriage as an institution glorifies this relationship and delegitimizes others in the eyes of society. And let's keep in mind that marriage is a legally binding and rigorous social code that does not allow people to choose the kind of relationship that most benefits them, and in that way we often hold people back and restrict people. And especially as people are getting older and the population is getting older, we're forcing people to stay married for even longer, and the stigma attached to divorce makes it really hard for people to leave those marriages. No, thank you. So why is this important? Why is it important that it's bad that we only legitimize one type of relationship? Because when you only ratify and celebrate this type of relationship, you tell single people that they have not succeeded unless they're married. You tell people that you have not achieved something unless you're in a marriage. And like we attach this prestige to marriage, and it makes it really, really difficult for people to admit that their marriage isn't working. And like more often than not, marriages don't work because humans aren't even strictly monogamous. And like we say that, and like it's true, like 40% of marriages end in failure. And if you were like someone in a management consultancy firm, you would absolutely not go with that bid because it's a terrible So when you force people to define themselves by just one relationship and one aspect of their lives, this has really real and damaging effects. And in the case of women, this is often much worse off, because women find it really way more difficult to escape marriages than men do. Why is this the case? Because women are often more economically poor. They can't afford to leave marriages. It allows economic abuse to happen in this respect. And also, like, women there's more stigma. No, thank you. It's more important for a woman to be married than a man, because if a man isn't married, he's a bachelor, and that's a very polite word to use. Whereas if a woman isn't married, there's actually no polite word for that at all. There's only spinster, which I want to reclaim. Let's join me in this. But anyway. And not only is this, but marriage actually becomes a tool for discrimination in that respect. You discriminate against single people, you discriminate against single parents, you discriminate against single mothers when you tell them that their relationships and their friendships and their cohabitation and their partners that they aren't married to aren't legitimate. And we use it to discriminate against unmarried groups. So there are some groups in society that are less likely to be married. For example, African Americans in the US are way likely to get married because of like economic reasons, and also like different ways of life. And we make these ways of life seem abnormal, and we make these ways of life seem like something that's not legitimate, and that has really real and damaging effects. And like, yeah. No, thank you. As I said, discrimination disproportionately affects women because women are more defined by their marital status than men. Sorry, yes.
So if you form long-term relationships with people on your side of the house, then you still have the same friends, the same home, etc. So it's just as difficult for you as a woman on your side of the house, then leave that because you're just as tied to that person, just not have a sheet of paper.
That actually segues straight into my next point. So this is about isolation and privacy. So what I'm going to talk about how narrowing our definition of love actually makes us lonelier than it does if we stayed in our marriages. Okay, so I was reading about this sociological report that married couples actually report greater social isolation than do single people. Why is this the case? Because if you're in a marriage, marriage is based upon the principle of self-sufficiency and financial independence. It's why people only get married when they have the money to and they're living alone. It's why people continually extending this threshold of marriage, because they don't want to commit to something when they can't be seen as doing it completely independently and self-sufficiently. So what this means is that when people are married, they don't feel like they can reach out to help, and also marriage has this thing where it's intensely private and nobody wants to intrude upon like the realm of marriage because it's so intensely private. So married couples actually report greater isolation. They're less likely to maintain close bonds with friends, families, parents and neighbours. They're less likely to reach out to others. No, thank you. And they're more likely to suffer silently if something is going wrong in their marriages because of the stigmas that the proposition has already talked about. And we see real evidence of this. We see Gay Byrne died last week, as my mum reminded me in a text today. He brought to light that the silent marriages in Ireland of people who were married 50, 60 plus years and still never even talk to each other in their marriages. It's because this intense privacy of marriage makes it easier for violence in the home to flourish. And we see this all the time. We see domestic abuse and marital rape go unreported and uninvestigated because society would rather not intrude on the private matters of marriage. And this only happens in marriage because the sociologists Gerstle and Sarkisian from the University of Massachusetts found that couples who cohabit and single people are more likely to spend time with friends and neighbours and maintain those other social bonds. That means that they have more access to help. That means that they have more people to go to if these kinds of things are happening. And this holds true across all socioeconomic and racial groups. Therefore, it is marriage itself which is isolating and marriage itself which is damaging women. So if we return to our key questions in this debate, is marriage essential for a good relationship, and is marriage good for society? First of all, is it essential for a good relationship? Absolutely not. Proposition has already established today that commitment and stability and love is essential, but you don't even get those things with marriage, and because it's like law and religion that's the most important thing about marriage, not the fact that like the most important thing should still be your love and commitment to the person. And the opposition has said to you time and time again that they've conformed to this very conservative view that the length of a marriage is the only thing that's successful. They say, oh, but marriage is more likely to last if we keep it going and if we keep the legal bonds there. That's not the most important thing about marriage. We think that the most important thing about marriage is the real and true like love bonds that are there and like stability for your children, and that we should really stop conforming to marriage because it's really only performative, and this social element is not enough for us to continue to prescribe to something that allows domestic abuse to happen and allows like abuse of women to happen every day. So for those two reasons, I beg you to propose.
I now call on the final speaker for the opposition, the final speaker for the night, Daniela Williams.
Cool beans. We're good? So far in this debate, we've seen two main points of clash. First, should long-term unions be binding? And second, does marriage hurt women? So I'm going to prove why the opposition is winning on both sides of this debate, now. So first, should long-term unions be binding? I personally think that the opposition is winning on this. Here's why. First, previous speakers told you that marriage gives people an impetus to stay together, to choose their partners wisely, and to resolve conflicts. Because a legal bond is hard to get out of. You put a lot more thought into like whether or not you're going to leave someone when you are legally bound to them, and when there's a lot of barriers to the exit than you do if you're not. Like that's like it, as Lucy told you, it prevents people from like holding each other hostage and like saying, oh, I'll leave, and offering weird ultimatums. Like it makes sure that people resolve conflicts wisely, and makes sure that people like put time and effort into thinking who they're going to choose as their partner, who they're going to choose to make them happy for the rest of their life. So how does the proposition respond? So first, one of the Sean says that if people love each other, they're going to stay together. But like, you know what? I fundamentally disagree with the whole idea that like love is the only thing, that like love and infatuation and cuddling are the only thing in a bond. Like there's kids, there's hard work, there's compromise. Like ultimately there's like love and like fluffy stuff is not the only thing that exists in a marriage, and like that's not the only thing that exists in any relationship. Like you have to continue to work hard, you have to continue to compromise, and marriage offers like an incentive and a legal bond to make sure that people continue to do that, rather than people holding each other hostage and offering ultimatums. No, thank you. Second, Eleanor talks about how legal ratification isn't like the point of marriage. Like the point of marriage is love and all that. But like remember that every single one of us like still stands by the idea that marriage is a celebration of love. Like none of us disagree with that. But here's why legal ramification is important. Because it adds security. Like security ultimately leads, and we believe that this is important because security leads to happiness. Like when you have fewer worries that your partner is going to leave you, when your fights ultimately have to be resolved because you're stuck with that person for quite a long time, like there's fewer worries, there's less anxiety, which really must be nice. Like you have to like sit down. You have to sit down and you have to work things through. You know that your partner is going to stay with you for a long time. You know that your partner won't be leaving. Therefore, you're not constantly worrying that your partner is going to run out of the door. You're not constantly like watching every single thing that you do to make sure that you're not like upsetting your partner. Because yeah, sure.
If you're suffering from domestic abuse, you're absolutely doing that.
Okay, I'll get to that in a second. Like you're not watching every single thing that you're doing to like make sure you don't upset your partner, because you know that your partner is like your partner is ultimately going to stay with you. And now like Amy talks about domestic abuse, sure, that's why we have divorce. Like the whole proposition posits divorce as being like antithetical to marriage. Divorce isn't antithetical to marriage. Divorce is an important and necessary escape hatch to marriage. So I think that that's kind of contradictory that you say that. So like remember what Sophie established when she told us that like
when she told us that the most important metric in this debate is which side provides the most amount of happiness, which side provides the most and highest quality of life. I believe that that's the opposition, because only the opposition guarantees that your partner will stay with you for a long time, that like your relationship will remain stable, that your relationship, no thank you, that your relationship will not collapse just because one person has a big massive argument. So you ought to prefer the proposition, because the proposition makes sure that people's marriages stay stable. But second, let's address the more fun question: which side hurts women? So like Lucy and Ega on the opposition both tell you that like love is more equal than it was in the past, and like I completely agree with that. Like love is adapted, like marriage has adapted, the state of the institution has adapted. However, the proposition all talk about how it has and continues to keep women in their place and makes women property. Now, I've got two main responses to this. First, no thank you. Misogyny wasn't invented by marriage. Like misogyny and treating women like property they're old as dirt. They've existed for a long time. Like Sophie told you that like misogyny is non-unique. Like it happens on both sides of the house, and she's completely right about that. But second, let's look at how it actually protected women in the past. So like 100 years ago, there wasn't exactly a welfare state or like some kind of safety net that happened if a man left a woman. And that was particularly bad because women historically were barred from working, especially women in higher classes. Therefore, like in a weird way, even though this wasn't the entire point of it, like marriage benefited women because it meant that a man had to stay with a woman. A man was like legally bound, not just like socially expected to provide for a woman, to put her in her will, to set up some kind of life insurance plan. No, thank you. To set up some kind of life insurance plan to make sure that woman would stay solvent and stay financially solvent. So like let's talk about what would happen like if that didn't exist, if there wasn't a legal protection and a man could just leave a woman at will in the past. So like because let's essentially women were property in the past, she'd get passed on to like her father or her brother or like whatever oldest surviving male relative existed. That's worse, because then that means that a woman like gets less money and like isn't taken care of as much. That's because there's like other people there's other people in the equation. There's like your mother, your sister, your sister's child, like there's a bunch of other relatives that like have to be accounted for, and like ultimately, no thank you, when that male relative dies, you don't get as much in the will. However, in a marriage, like you become the primary beneficiary. So like we've established that misogyny occurs on both sides of the house, and like Sophie told Amy in a point of information, like even cohabiting, like women still face stigma. Like it's non-unique, and to claim that like marriage propagates or marriage doesn't propagate it, like ultimately doesn't matter. Like in the past, marriage allowed more women to be financially solvent. No thank you. Marriage allowed more women to be more financially solvent, which is why we ought to prefer the proposition, because marriage ensured that women were at least provided for, even though the marriages might not have been as happy, even though the marriages might not have been perfect. Like that's still non-unique. That would have happened on either side of the house in like a long-term cohabitation. At the end of the day, marriage did allow women to like stay financially afloat and to not become penniless when like their long-term partner decided to just leave them. So why should you prefer the opposition? Because only the opposition provides for greater quality of life, for more security, for more stability, more happiness. And the opposition makes sure that people remain contented. And second of all, the opposition historically has helped women. Therefore, I oppose. Thank you.
That concludes the competitive part of the debate. I will now ask the adjudicators to retire to consider their verdict. We will not put the motion to the House until they leave, so that they are not swayed by whether you vote in favour of marriage or against. This will be a completely independent decision. Please, we're not trying to influence them with anything else.
Sign my sheet of paper with her name. Sign beside your name. I want to keep this. Just keep out like squishy mouth.
Now that they are gone, I will put the motion. Now that they are gone, I will put the motion to the House. All those in favour of the motion that this House regrets the institution of marriage, please say aye. Aye! All those against, please say nay.
Nay!
Is that the division? We have a division.
There is a division, so the votes will be recounted. So this time, all of those in favour of aye on the proposition, please raise your hand, and the man librarian will count these votes.
Yeah, I love that. I'm 16 bucks. Yeah, 16 the only. It's the only. I know, it's really cute. I was like, guys, this is really cute. Because
All those against, please raise your hand.
You guys aren't looking
it's so floaty. It's so tiny,
Sean, or Sean.
The motion is carried. I will now call upon the chair to say a few words. The chair, please say a few words. I will. Okay, I have to begin with some questions. We heard at the very beginning in private business from the president of the society, Dave McConnell, from former ogre of the society, Ursula Quill, about the big task I was given 7 years ago in 2012 to write a history of the society. And of course I said yes, because in 2012 anything was possible. 7 years ago seemed so far away. You know what I said? The big challenge is it's too far away. Like there's no point starting it now. I should write another book first. That book was never written. I will tie it into the motion because I did get married as well. When I did, an historian told me the most eminent historian of Irish history on these islands, he warned me. Some not well known. Although the society says it all the time in its opening statement, my first sentence of the book begins with